I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to hand it over to Grace to get us started. So we'll start with introduction to Grace. So Dr. Grace Nosek is a legal scholar focusing on climate misinformation, protest, and democracy, as well as a longtime community organizer. She centers justice, joyful community, hope, agency, civic engagement, and systems change in her work and scholarship. As a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, Grace is researching novel strategies to empower youth in democratic decision-making and to inoculate youth against climate despair. Grace is a past Canada-US Fulbright recipient. She holds a BA from Rice University, a law degree from Harvard Law School, a Master's of Laws and PhD in law from the University of British Columbia. And she's never met a dance party that she didn't want to join, and I can attest to that. I've danced with Grace many times, and I also want to say that Grace gives the absolute best bear hugs you can imagine. I'm sure there's some people in the Zoom room that have experienced that and can attest to it. It's just a wonderful way to brighten your day. Okay, and so Jamie is an environmental communicator and strategist living on the unceded Musqueam and Kakite lands. She is a SFU alumni and a communications professional by trade. She believes storytelling is a tool to imagine and advocate for a just and equitable world, especially when marginalized narratives are centered at the heart of collective change. As the Director of Development at Embark Sustainability, Jamie works to deepen relationships between local organizations, grassroots efforts, and university students while exploring promising practices in climate knowledge mobilization and advocacy. In her free time, you'll find Jamie watching copious amounts of television, noodling on the keyboard, and hanging out with her cat. And last but not least, Uma Ladaka is originally from Vancouver and is currently in her fourth year of undergrad at McGill University in Montreal, completing a joint honors thesis program in anthropology and Latin American and Caribbean studies. From the age of 15, Uma was lucky enough to be involved in climate justice movements. Today, Uma is involved in a range of activities and projects, from student involvement to community-led research, most of which have allowed Uma to continue exploring the intersectional nature of the impact that climate change has on communities around the world. I think I first met Uma when you were just a teenager, and it's so amazing to see you now. I've only met you a couple times, but Grace has mentioned you in such incredible ways, and it's great to have you and Jamie on the call. And the three of us kind of have different connections to each other. I met Grace when I was a research fellow at the David Suzuki Foundation and has since become a dear friend over the past 6 or 7 years. And it's just a reminder to how much getting involved in climate action is it really enriches your life in incredible ways. And you develop lifelong friendships and really important relationships as a part of that. And I see my relationship with you, Grace, as that. So I'm so honored to be able to host you today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Tara, for those beautiful introductions. It's such a delight to be here today. This is for me, this is the guts of life, just talking about this stuff in community with dear ones. So really excited. We have an awesome program ahead and a lot of cool conversations. And Uma, maybe you can talk a little bit about how we met. I know the beginning of the story, which is that I came to give a talk to your class when you were 15. And then you really just took that talk and you ran with it.
Yeah, so when I was 15, Grace came to my school. I was doing an outdoor education program at Prince of Wales and gave a really inspiring talk on hopeful storytelling around climate. And before that, I'll get into it more throughout the presentation, but I definitely had a lot of anxiety and a lot of apathy towards it because it really feels like one of those issues that's just too big to take on. But yeah, through volunteering with the Climate Hub, which Grace was the founder of, and a very big part of that time at UBC, I was able to kind of combat that and meet a lot of people in the climate community that like really inspired me to make change and take on these issues that feel very big and overwhelming.
It's so fun to be on the panel with you today, Uma. 6 years later, like now we're speaking together. And Uma, you just met Jamie through this conversation, right?
Yeah, it's so funny because I feel like every time we do a climate event, I make like a new climate friend, and me and Jamie just met last week over Zoom, and I already feel like I have another like ally in the community. It's really, really nice. And I think Jamie also has a really awesome story about how her and Grace met like many, many years ago. So I think it's a really nice full circle moment.
It really does feel full circle to have us all in a room together today. I think it's a testament to the warmth of your connection building, Grace. Because similar to you, Una, which by the way, it's been so lovely meeting you. This has been a wonderful way to get to know each other. I think it was about 5 years ago at the very end of my undergrad degree, I was attending a career night where Grace was a speaker. And at the time, I was feeling a lot of hopelessness and a lot of tension around whether or not I could really pursue environmental communication and climate action as a part of the work that I had built towards through my degree. And I left that career night alongside Grace. We happened to have a great chat just walking down the block, received one of those fantastic bear hugs, as well as I think like an email to several network connections. And it just left me feeling like, oh, if this is a world I build myself into, I know that there's community around and that this is a good thing to be sharing my time with. So thank you so much for that, Grace. It's really set us on the path to today.
It was so moving when you told me that last week, Jamie, because when we got on the call, I was like, wait, you look familiar. And Jamie was like, oh yeah, you gave me a big bear hug 5 years ago. So yeah, I just think this is the richness. Like I tell people that leaning into climate work, there is so much grief, but it is the best, most meaningful thing I've ever done in a world where a lot of us are lonely and anxious and tired and wanting that kind of deep connection and to be seen and held. So yeah, I love kicking it off in this kind of relational way. So with that, I think we'll get into a little, I've got a little PowerPoint, as one does, and we'll get into a little conversation, and please do throw your questions in the chat. I love having really interactive Zooms. It's been so cool to use that technology. I've been going into classrooms and I find people do actually ask questions and engage and show that Zoom is not perfect, but it is something we can use in this world if we don't want to always be flying around. So with that, maybe I will share my screen and we will get into it. Alrighty, the moment of truth. Normal view. Slideshow. All right, you can see what a technical wizard I am. So folks, you can see everything? Okay, so Uma and Jamie, I'm gonna just have this conversation with you, but folks, please pop it in the chat, and Tara, if answers come through that you wanna say. I like to just start here. What is an influencer? Jamie and Uma, what do you think of? Who do you think of when you think of the word influencer?
I've been thinking about this question a lot in the last couple of days, and I think that there's a lot of different niches that influencers fill, but ultimately most of them, I guess in the more traditional sense of the word, is they, kind of infect you with these like ideas and these narratives. And these can be negative and positive, but a lot of it is like, I think there's one side that's very heavy on individualism and consumption. And that is the consumption of the story, which leads you to consume things, which leads you to, relate to people and act around people differently. And of course there's positive influencers as well. But I think when the first thing that pops into my head is really that like consumption, that commodity fetishism that influencers are really pushing on like social media platforms, especially like TikTok and Instagram.
I love that. And I love that word infect. There's like a virality to it, right? That it just goes from person to person really quickly. Jamie, anything to add to that? Why is it effective when influencers, like how do they get people to want to do it, and what are they selling ultimately?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a really good question. When I think about like just the concept of influencer, I think about sort of like lifestyles being sold to us. And I think maybe there's an awareness. It's like, oh yeah, that's a really interesting lifestyle. I'd look to like explore more. But the thing that we're not noticing is all the built-in assumptions with what concepts go along with that lifestyle. What assumptions are we making about the world around us when we involve ourselves in those lifestyles? Because they often have a lot to do with consumption, have a lot to do with the existing systems we're in, and they don't encourage us to ask a lot of questions about it. So yeah, it can be sort of like an easy thing to slip into of like, oh, I love this lifestyle, but what does that lifestyle mean? And what are the concepts that are inherent within it?
Yeah, I love that. This sense of they're not really selling a product, they're selling you an idea of who you want to be. They're tapping into that sense. They know we're tired and lonely and anxious. And it's like, if you just get this cup, you'll be hydrated forever and you can do everything on your to-do list and you'll be happy. So this concept that they're selling ideas, I think, is so powerful, and it's really useful when we want to talk about climate obstruction, that young folks really understand influencers. Oh, you don't want to go forward? There we go. So yeah, these ideas, they shape what we buy, as you folks so helpfully pointed out. And then I loved that they shape how we move through the world and how we treat each other. And if we start thinking of ourselves as consumers rather than maybe members of a collective or these other things, and it happens, you both mentioned this at kind of like an unconscious level. We don't even know really that we're taking on these trappings and these stories. And this is, this has, to me, this piece from the social science has been so helpful in my own life, so revelatory. But essentially what the social science says is that people's level of motivation and actions are based more on what they believe to be true than what is objectively the case. What we believe is true shapes our actions and motivations more than what is actually true. And that shows you the power of stories and ideas.
I won't lie, I kind of live under a rock when it comes to the internet and internet trends. But when Jamie was talking about the influence that you have in your, like outside of those parasocial relationships and off of social media and within your community, and maybe social media does play a role in that. I mean, it's a great communication tool. I was really thinking about like that first experience that I had with you of creating this speech for City Hall in Vancouver and on the climate accountability motion. And me and a couple of other friends decided to go. We had never spoken in public before, and it was a very nerve-wracking experience, but Grace, of course, helped us through that, as did our parents and our other friends and the rest of our community. So that was like the first building block where I saw that, like, people are willing to help you, people are willing to step in, people are willing to support you. And I think that for me personally, the influence that Grace had on me was with her hopeful climate narrative and this new angle that she was coming at it from, made this issue so much less heavy for me. And I think that this has a lot to do with like being a minority, and for a lot of racialized folks, these issues feel like a lot to take on top of everything that you deal with day to day. And so instead of this being one more thing to feel like I had to stand up for, or one more thing that I felt like I had to put on my plate, it became something where I found community. And that was something that I feel like I really lacked at that age when I was 15, 16, growing up in Vancouver and not having people around me that were like me in so many ways. The climate community like really embraced me in that sense. So it became this like really joyful thing. And I think that once you get a taste of A, the community, and B, being able to make change as a very young person. And often these folks that are doing these things are minorities in whatever sense, or are marginalized in whatever sense. I think that you just want to keep coming back because it's so joyful. And it really feeds something inside of you, especially when you just feel like you have the weight of the world on your shoulders. So I guess that's kind of where my mind was going when Jamie was speaking about that, because I feel like it was really inspiring to see my friends take this on, and my family be curious. So yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking about during this.
I love that, Uma. God, that's so, here I am trying to be like straight part, center part, and you're like, actually, it fundamentally changed my outlook on the world, and then I influenced everyone in my life to care as well. And they do say that teens and kind of young folks are the most effective at getting their parents and grandparents to care about climate. So this is, I think we should be flipping it around from like, why should we help youth on climate, to these are the best ambassadors we could possibly ever have on bold, profound, intersectional climate justice. And we should be empowering them, amplifying them, resourcing them, funding them in every possible way. And ROOTBOUND, as we'll get into in a little bit, is kind of my love letter to folks on the front line and protesters and organizers and the youth who have been holding it down with their moral clarity forever. But man, that was so cool. I mean, you influenced me, Uma. I wasn't going to go speak at that city hall because I didn't think I had time, and I was doing all these other things. And then you and Nina and your friends were like, we're going. And I was like, well, I can't let the 15-year-old speak, and I'm not going to go. So then I wrote a speech, and I still have your speech on somewhere hanging in my house because it was so beautiful. And it was so brave. You guys got questions from the city councilors. And then, yeah, you just didn't stop. It just kept going from there. That was just like so cool. So we know that what influencers are. We know that youth can be influencers. And this is kind of my academic wheelhouse, that the fossil fuel industry can be an influencer and can be an influencer in some of the same ways as other people. What we saw is that influences can be really positive. We can bring our community in, we can bring them along. For example, that's exactly what they say about voting, that if you see your community is voting really explicitly, you'll come along. But we also know that there's this kind of consumptive corporate influence that's kind of sneaky and happening in the background. And the fossil fuel industry is the absolute master of this kind of influence. This is my PhD thesis, tracks just these dozens and dozens of tentacles that they use to kind of subconsciously get into the minds of the nation. And, you know, one of the things that you guys pointed out about influencers is sometimes they're successful because people don't know that they are being paid to give that influence. And that is like hook, line, and sinker, exactly what the fossil fuel industry does. They fund all these vouchers and community leaders. And so people don't know that they're interacting with the fossil fuel industry and its ideas and its messaging, or how deeply they've seeded some of their narratives. But here's just one insidious example. The Natural Gas Federation in the US paid to have all these influencers post about natural gas. And they've been doing that for decades, almost a century. Now we're cooking with gas is a phrase from the industry that has kind of seeped into our popular culture. This is a really interesting one, as there's a lot of live debates around natural gas right now and some of its dangers in the home and these things, and looking at how it became so popular through a lot of industry influence. And the other thing that's really interesting is that we have this battle of the influencers now. We've got youth on one side who really understand the urgency of climate change, who really understand its intersectionality, that this is a justice issue. This is not about polar bears. This is like the greatest human rights issue of our time, and it will exacerbate every other injustice. And every injustice is exacerbated by it. And then we have kind of the fossil fuel industry, and I've tracked all these different narratives that they're seeding into the public. And youth are also the ones really calling out that corporate power. That's what the divestment movement has always been, taking away that social capital of the fossil fuel industry, because they turn to universities and they say, look, we're funding research, we're doing the hard work. So youth have been at this forefront of calling out this kind of corporate influence and what corporations did, because they didn't just sell us energy. This is the point I always make. I have read these original documents. I've sat in my sweltering apartment being in 100-degree heat. I mean, I don't know if that'll mean anything to anyone in Canada, but in a heat dome, just overwhelmingly hot with my autoimmune condition, reading these original documents of them knowing 50 years ago with such precision what was coming. And they made that choice. So that's why we hold them accountable, and we're skeptical of the power they take over democracy. And not only did they hide the science from people, they've blocked government action at every possible step. So it's exciting to have this clash of influence. And one of the things we'll get into is that the fossil fuel industry knows how powerful youth are. And two, they're not as good a storyteller as, honestly, just about any Gen Z on TikTok. That's why they hire influencers themselves, because they cannot have the same genuine passion, authenticity, just messaging that understands, because they're mimicking. They're not of it. They're not of that love and change and forefront of culture. So it may seem like a skewed battle, but it's actually kind of going to be not a fair fight, obviously billions on this side, but it's going to be a robust fight. Youth are not taking this sitting down. And again, the wild thing here is that what we believe about our world becomes our world. So it's going to be such a critical battle. And one of the wildest things I tracked in my research is how the fossil fuel industry specifically targets youth. And it does that because it knows youth are powerful. It knows that youth do shape culture in really profound ways. So this is an actual piece of curricula written by a fossil fuel industry advocate that has been in use before. And it's a jump rope rhyme in elementary classrooms. It could still be being used out there. It's from the last 10 years. And it says, we need oil, we need gas. Where are the oil products in our class? And it's from a huge curricula of other things like this. You can see how that profoundly shapes someone's worldview from a very young age, which is, again, kind of what I get to in the novel, of how this outsized power is shaping the minds of young people before they're even aware that is possible. Here again, this is another kind of influencer with their natural gas stove. And this is the one that I think is so wild. This is a model bill from the US, and it was created by industry working together with conservative lawmakers. And what they wanted was to create a bill that would essentially undermine climate change and climate science being taught in schools in the US. And they create a model bill, and then state legislatures can use that bill and pass it into law. And this one is called the Environmental Literacy Improvement Act. Funny, because it's trying to undermine the teaching of climate science. But in this model bill, industry tells on itself. It tells exactly what it doesn't want youth to do. And what it says no environmental program should be designed to change student behavior, attitudes, or values, and should not include instruction in political action skills nor encourage political action. They don't want us to be political. They wrote it down. They put it in a model bill. And so this is a piece of the conversation that I always think is missing, that the fossil fuel industry is very explicitly trying to get young people out of democracy, out of institutional participation. And we should be talking about that when we think about democracy and the university role in democracy. So we're going to get into some of the stories that this battle is producing, like the fossil fuel industry, kind of the poison stories that they're seeding into our imagination. And Jamie and Uma, it would be awesome at this point if we could kind of all introduce the story, and then maybe we can talk about why you think that, how you might think that would feel for youth. So one thing that we know that the fossil fuel industry is seeding, the fossil fuel industry and its kind of advocates, its allies, are they're promoting this sense of cynical fatalism about government action on climate change. And this is actually some research that has come out of an SFU scholar who's amazing. We can probably pop that in the chat. But it shows that like across newspaper coverage and these other media, there's this real sense of people saying that governments haven't done anything and never will do anything, and that they're giant hypocrites. And what we know now is that there's actually more people who believe climate change is happening, but that there's nothing we can do about it, than there are who don't believe in climate change. That's become a much smaller group, but the people who think it's real, but that there's nothing we can do, is becoming bigger. And it has this irony of like the fossil fuel industry is blocking government action, and has in every possible way, and then points to kind of government failure. And I'm just curious, Uma and Jamie, at first pass, like, how do you think that would make youth feel? And again, it's not like they're going to have a sign that says it's from Exxon, like, hate your government. This is much more subtle, the messaging. But why do you think that might land in a hard way? Maybe we'll start with you, Jamie.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense that that cynical fatalism works in that like insidious way when it sort of trickles into the way that we talk about climate change, because we all know and we're all seeing sort of like the polycrises that we face. And for a lot of marginalized folks, there's a lot of different systems that you're sort of working against and under, and it can feel fatalistic if you're sort of fed that information of like, oh, well, you probably shouldn't try. And yeah, it's a real sort of shame to see, and a shame to see on the slide before, as you had it pointed out, just it's written so plainly of what behavior it's trying to endorse and what it's trying to get folks to not do. So yeah, I think it's really clear like why that is sort of like a route that has been driven, and like why youth fall into that sometimes. What I wanted to share on that, like pulling from the work of Embark Sustainability, is typically when we're chatting, it pops up, right? That cynical fatalism. And the way that we work through it a lot is through creativity. But yeah, it's sort of like a constant. It's something to have to like push up against. Uma, I don't know if you have any experience with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because now, coming from like such a long journey in like dealing with these kinds of narratives, I feel like I look at this and I'm like, a lot of young people, if you took out the factor in education where, you know, it's being kind of, it's people are being told not to engage politically, not to be in these radical spaces, which aren't radical at all, they're just community spaces. Like, most people in those spaces would look at this and recognize how climate is intrinsically connected to all these other issues that we're working on. And so you can come at climate from so many different angles and work on so many different pieces of it together. It's not just one big issue that you need to take on, like, from, you know, and carry the whole thing through. So I don't know, I think that when I was 15, these narratives really worked on me, and it took a lot of work to, you know, pull me out of that cycle, and make me feel empowered again, particularly on climate, even if that wasn't the case with other kind of social justice issues that I was like encountering at the time. So yeah, I think that it's definitely effective. And I think that the educational aspect of it is, to me, the most disheartening and scary, because, you know, teachers and schools and the education system is what you're supposed to trust, and it's what you're taught is right. So being discouraged from these, like, you know, they're framed as these like terrible spaces you don't want to go, you don't want to become, you know, too outspoken, too political. But really, they're the places where you find friendship and, you know, community. So, and you're really able to think through these things. Like, I think in our last meeting, I was talking about how intersectionality and having an intersectional identity is like speaking many languages. And when you speak more than one language, it's much easier to learn another. And I think that that's kind of one of the analogies that has helped me the most throughout like my journey in combating these narratives and this hopelessness. And I wish that those ideas had been shared with me earlier than, you know, the 10th grade, because I think I did experience a lot of anxiety.
Wow, that is profound. Thanks, Suma. Thanks, Jamie. I see we've got about 20 minutes, so to make sure we get to all the juicy stuff further, what I think I'll do is just quickly name the narratives and we can bring them back up when you guys talk if you want to. But just some other narratives to be aware of and some original documents, because I think it's quite shocking. This one is wild. This one's from Canada. It's by a PR firm, Navigator, and it doesn't name its clients, but it's pretty clear that they're corporations. And it's against a new government regulation. This was back in 2018, but it was against a new government regulation that was trying to reduce pollution, the Clean Fuel Standard. And the strategy is that one thing is that we need to get the public to appreciate that fighting climate change is a losing battle. I just think that's so wild to actually, again, see it written down that some of this sense of hopelessness and doomism is indeed being seeded by folks who are allies of the fossil fuel industry. And that hopelessness is crushing. When I am in schools, and Uma, we've talked about this, Jamie, we've talked about this, but that sense that you do not have a future is crushing. It sweeps out your hope about everything else, like your dreams of who you want to be and the kids you want to have, which is just like the joy of childhood, the ability to have these dreams and this sense of futurity is knocked out. So I just think it's so morally repugnant. And it's also why I think we need to challenge the narratives now so that we protect youth in the present. There's this hypocrisy narrative, again, just trying to get people to feel apathetic. Don't care, don't engage, don't look. And just no one can change, no one is different, everyone is the worst. You know, apathy is how the fossil fuel industry wins. So here's just some media post about Greta Thunberg is a hypocrite, Al Gore is a hypocrite. And again, it's like, don't have a hero, don't believe in people who care about climate. They do these things. So again, that sense of just apathy, don't care, don't check in, don't come into this fight. And then I've been starting to call this one, he who smelt it, dealt it, or they who smelt it, dealt it. From when I was little, that's what you used to say when someone farted and would blame it on someone else. Because I just think it's such a good way to remember that's literally what the fossil fuel industry is doing. Like, they farted big time on climate change and they're just pointing at everyone else and they're like, it's your fault, your emissions. BP popularized the carbon footprint with a $100 billion campaign. And it's not to say we shouldn't care about what we do and our impact, but they're turning that all inwards, like what I as a consumer can do, where we really want to think about our power as members of a collective and a community. Here's my very intense slide that just reminds us that because of our beliefs shaping how we act and how we feel so powerfully, if these stories make young people feel helpless, hopeless, and like democracies have failed them, they will sit out. And that is what the fossil fuel industry wants. This is just an amazing campaign. I encourage you all to look it up. It's called the Truth Anti-Smoking Campaign in the US. And there's really robust evidence that this youth-led kind of rogue art campaign that called out the tobacco industry's manipulation of youth reduced youth smoking rates. So I have been wanting to do something like this with youth coming after the fossil fuel industry and the original documents for a long time. And this is, one of the things we wanted to talk about is how joyful some of this climate action can be. and what it looks like to try. So I always really, really encourage people, if you're not sure what you want to do on climate, like do it with someone you love, like find a friend and drag them along. And so at least then you'll be doing it with someone you love, or do it in a way that gets you the new skill that you want or the new space that you're trying. And I just love reading young adult fantasy novels. And so I got this grant to turn my PhD thesis on fossil fuel industry, misinformation, and democracy into this young adult climate fantasy novel. And so much of that was because a novel gives you space to really talk about the systems that have led us to climate change, all the isms, capitalism, racism, patriarchy, sexism. And it also gives you space to show the joy of leaning into climate work, what collective organizing looks like, what, joining hands with your dear ones in the face of an existential threat, how much wonder there can be in that. And also just like, I think we need to try dumb things. Like I like to say I'm in my dumb era sometimes because it's about play, and you can't really have play without safety. And so there's just all this sense of like possibility, and that there's not just one way to do this. And it's been one of the most, I think it is probably the most meaningful thing I've ever done, and the way youth have been responding to it, because one of the big ideas is that youth have started and are going to continue making their own art and fan fiction in the universe. So as they spend time there, they'll learn more about climate action, and there's lots of kind of links in the book to actual research, but also how to move through their climate anxiety and climate grief, and just get to create and play and have this be a pull into rather than a push, like I should. Like you can kind of see the cover, it's like a portal, like, ooh, or not, a portal that disappeared. A portal that pulls you in, and that's what I want the world to be. Uma, you have been on this Rootbound journey with me for a couple of years. You've made some art and some incredible memes in this space. Like, do you want to say anything about Rootbound and this play and art making, and maybe share that quote about that person who,
So I was brought on to Rootbound, I think it must have been 2021. And I essentially ran social media, which was a really fun experience for me. I would not say that I am an artistic person, but I'm definitely creative. So it was really nice to find like a space within this. And I think that is important to highlight because my strength is definitely not like something visual or, creative writing, but there's space for everyone, and whatever skill you have, like, to bring it into Rootbound and this world that Grace has created. And it was really, really nice. I think a big highlight for me was being able to connect my very creative and talented friends into this world, and empowering young people and engaging artists and intellectuals that deserve to be engaged and deserve to be showcased. So I'll read this message that Grace got from somebody that read the initial draft of Rootbound. So they said, I read the initial draft of Rootbound that you sent me a few weeks ago, and I absolutely loved it. I wish more than anything that I could have read this book when I first got involved in climate activism as a teenager and was struggling with climate anxiety. I completely agree that it was profoundly life-affirming and healing. It reminded me why I do the work that I do, and honestly fueled me more than anything has in a long time. I mean, reading this, as someone who did have something kind of akin to Rootbound, which was Grace as a mentor at that age, I see why this would have been so empowering for those who weren't maybe as lucky as me at that time. The great news is now Rootbound exists and is accessible to you. So.
Uma, thank you. You're the best type person. One of the big things that the book calls us into, like there's so many ways of remembering our power to turn outwards rather than to just always turn in as consumers. But I think because there's 2 elections coming up, today we'll focus on voting in our last 10 minutes and kind of some of the social science and how and why we can do that. And I know voting sparks a lot of different issues for people who think it replaces grassroots organizing or supports a state that they maybe don't agree with. And I understand those critiques. Where I come from voting is that I know that the fossil fuel industry doesn't want us to vote. And so automatically, if ExxonMobil doesn't want me to do something, I'm going to try and get people to do it. And also because I'm also a scholar of protest, and it's very clear now that elected officials are working with the fossil fuel industry in the US, in Canada, in Australia to target climate protesters, and that corporations more broadly are working together with largely conservative lawmakers to target social justice and Indigenous-led movements. And so voting shapes our ability to protest. If we lose that ability, the slide into fascism becomes a lot faster. So that's where I come at it on voting, that it's a way to protect our right to protest. It's a way to expand what we can do with our grassroots organizing. And I have this little thing. You can also see this is how I worked it into the book, because you might be asking, how does a book do this? And I would encourage you to read it. There's going to be, I think Tara will say where the links are, and there will also be a free audio version on YouTube for youth around the world or anyone around the world early next week as well, if price is an issue. So, but it does really pull on my thesis and have all these themes in it. And then in the back matter, I also offer like a few more explicit calls to action. So maybe Jamie, you could read the little one about voice, vote, volunteer as I pull it up.
Absolutely, yeah. These are Grace's words from the author's notes of ROOTBOUND. I'll share one little tool I created to help remind myself and my people that we can cultivate our power as members of a collective rather than as individual consumers, to turn outwards on climate action rather than inwards. When I get stuck in the grocery store for what feels like hours, reading fine print and spinning out over which light bulb is better for the environment, I chant the 3 V's to myself: voice, volunteer, vote. I remind myself to channel all that precious energy and care for the world into something more collective, more systemic, more justice-oriented than agonizing over a light bulb. That hour in consumer limbo could instead go to emailing all of my representatives about creating a robust youth climate corps, or calling my bank and requesting they divest from funding resources projects that infringe on Indigenous sovereignty. So the 3 V's are voice our climate's concerns to friends, family, institutions, and government representatives. Social science says we are the most powerful climate advocates for our own communities. Volunteer with groups and people that light us up inside and in ways that feel joyful and generative and let us explore new skills. And if you're a group with the capacity to do so, pay youth climate organizers. They deserve it, and it's a critical way to move beyond an environmental movement that is disproportionately centered whiteness and wealth. And lastly, vote for climate justice champions and or against climate arsonists, and get as many friends as we can to join us. Publicly advocating for climate justice is a privilege, one that is being increasingly threatened around the world. Environmental dissent is being targeted, sometimes violently, by corporations and governments. For those of us who can, let's turn outwards on climate action, towards our sports teams, our book clubs, our schools, our governments, our grassroots movements, our unions, and more, to dream about and work together towards a more just and sustainable world. It's beautiful, Grace.
Thank you. You read it so well. So I know we have 5 minutes. So Tara, maybe what I'll ask you folks to do is to start putting some of the links in the chat to some voting resources for people. And I'll go through, here are just some things. If you're like, yeah, I want to do this, what do I do? Let's end on that. And then I'll stick around if anyone has questions for the last 15 minutes. I think Uma and Tara can, and we will applaud Jamie because Jamie might have to run off. And you've been amazing, Jamie. So again, yeah, this is my whole campaign. Like, let's piss off ExxonMobil. It's jolly good fun. And so how do we empower our community to vote? The weird thing here is that social media is actually extremely effective. It's rarely extremely effective. But because what we now know from the social science is that this sense that your community is voting and that you are expected to participate is so powerful. Social media can do that. And the other thing is to get your people, help them make logistical plans. And you don't have to do it in a patronizing way. Often I'll just make my plan and send it around and be like, does anyone want to join? Do you have your voting plan? Is there anything you want me to help look up with you? It's so important to actually, before the day, know where you're voting. What are you going to do if it's raining? Do you have childcare? Do you have transit? Do you have these options? And maybe if you know someone who doesn't, maybe you can help them get them there, because it's ridiculous that we don't have free transit to, all of these things. But the voting plan is really important, particularly for young folks, particularly for students. Showing that their community is voting is really helpful. And engaging people's personal accountability to follow through in a vote. Ask them to commit to voting. And if they do it publicly, even better. And if they're asked by someone they trust. That's why we have so much power over our own community, like our 5 people. This is what the Obama campaign used. I interned in the Obama White House, and this is the social science that I kind of picked up along the way, and they did it really effectively to empower folks. And then my other thing, okay, check these out. This was a campaign I ran, just rogue, with a friend, because we were like, why isn't the university doing more to support youth voting in a nonpartisan way? And so we got young folks to just post photos of themselves with their voting buddies about their voting plan. And we really encouraged them to do it in community, in goofy ways. We went to the athletes, we took the photos for them. But showing voting is not just this serious thing that policy wonks do, but that it can be an expression of love for your community. For me, that's what it is. This is how I voice part of the way I want to shape my ability to organize. And so I just love these. They got so much more engagement than a serious photo saying you got to vote or moralizing, but just yeah, we're doing this. It's expected and it can be fun. I always got breakfast with my voting buddy. We always got pancakes. We made a whole thing out of it. And then public universities. If any of you are at a university in any capacity as a student, prof, staff, anything, do you know how that university is going to tell young people how to vote? Because my universities did not in the past have a plan to send out an email to all of their students. And I knocked on doors until they did have a plan. And I put them in contact with the people they would need. And I just did it on my own. But I was like, this is a gap. Public universities should be a cornerstone of democracy. We know that voting is kind of the gateway to more participation in democracy. And I'm not even talking about the state here, just democracy, civic engagement. That's our lifeblood as a society, just coming together to take care of ourselves. So voting is the gateway. Once you do that, you come in more. And if you don't vote when you're younger, you don't vote when you're older. And we now also know that young people feel this kind of intense anxiety around climate because they don't feel like they have agency. So I really kind of see these as all tied together, that this is part of our mental health work, is providing this nonpartisan information to everyone on campus, making it as easy as possible for young people to feel powerful in their own governments. So I would really encourage you all to do this. I was shocked what I found when I did it. And then professors, are they taking 2 minutes of their class? Are you a professor? Are you a student in your class? Can you ask if you can take 2 minutes? I, again, as a student, just went around to classroom after classroom for a couple minutes. I just emailed the profs to see if I could give them the information. And that way you reach hundreds of people at once, which is really exciting. Yeah, so I think that's the end. I was going to read a little excerpt and call out Shake Up the Establishment is amazing. If you're in Canada, cannot recommend them highly enough. They have an incredible resource. Go to them for the election. Go to Apathy is Boring, and go to Environmental Voter Project. If you're in the US, connected to the US, care about the US, for some incredible get out the vote resources. Tara, maybe I'll hand it over to you for a second to thank Jamie and...
Thank you so much, Grace. What an incredible journey of a presentation you took us on. There was so much in there and such good dialogue between the three of you. It was a real treat to listen to. So thank you to you, Grace, Jamie, and Uma for participating in this. And I really appreciate your calls to action for the elections that are coming up. For the folks that are in BC, October 19th is the BC provincial election. Vote with a friend, vote early if you can, go for brunch. I love that idea, actually. And just to emphasize your point, Grace, a lot of the ridings are won on small margins. So these actions really do make a difference. Sometimes it's like 100 votes or 200 votes. And so you talking to that lecture hall or whatever it might be can be the thing that tips it. So just want to emphasize how important that is. I'm going to close here, but I wanted to share a colleague asked in the chat to share a project that they are working on, a grad student here at SFU, a really cool project that's aligned with this called Futopia. Julia's there, got her hand up. So if you're interested in this project, please get in touch with Julia. The other thing I wanted to say is Siri is hoping to do a series on cultivating climate hope. So stay tuned to our channels for a follow-up event on this. We're not really sure what the focus is going to be yet, but we really like this theme of hope and joy and creativity. So we're hoping to do more of those. So stay tuned to us. And just on that note, for those that are still around, we just wanted to do a quick poll to inform our next event related to this theme. So we're just going to add a little poll, one question poll on what would be a theme you would want to explore for us to explore in our next event. So if you could fill that out, if you're still on the call, that would be awesome. Also, feel free to email us at any point to chat about future events. So on that note, I'm going to officially close, but like we said, we'll stick around on the call for 15 more minutes if folks want to chat or if anyone has any questions or wants
We
to.
just give a huge round of applause for Uma and Jamie and Tara and the staff at Siri. Like, I'm already getting messages, Uma and Jamie, about how incredible you were. I know it's not easy to do this, and you knocked it out of the park. Like, it was so special to do it with you. And you too, Tara, dear friend.
Thank you. And I should say thank you too to the Siri team, Jesse and Joanna and Stephen and Gray in the background who have been instrumental in making this happen.
Thank you so much, Uma, Grace, Tara, Siri team. This has been really wonderful, really appreciative. I do have to sign off, so I hope that the achievement discussion is fruitful and really lovely. Sorry to be missing it, but thank you so much for this. Everybody take care.
We'll keep in touch.